right, well, hello and welcome to the book launch for Women Defying Hitler, Resistance and Rescue Under the Nazis. The idea for the book began when Dr. Nathan Stoltzfus invited Dr. Mordechai Paldiel to give a talk at Florida State University. This led to a conference that the Rintel's Professorship for Holocaust Studies co-sponsored with Volker Berghan and Columbia University's History Department in October of 2018. This conference was part of an ongoing effort toward giving women's history and women's defiance their due, and was held on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the Rosenstrasse protest in February of 1943 by non-Jewish women demanding the release of their Jewish husbands rounded up for their dispatch from Berlin. This also led to the founding of the Rosenstrasse Foundation, which is dedicated to honoring the memory of these women protesters, connecting their descendants, and serves as a model and an inspiration concerning the importance of protest and the responsibility of the community to make a difference. This book examines various forms of resistance to Nazism within Germany, as well as in a few countries under German occupation. It raises questions about whether the inclusion of women's resistance could reshape existing categories and understandings of defiance. So let me introduce our panelists and contributors to the book. So first we have Judy Baumel-Schwartz, and she is the director of the Finkler Institute of Holocaust Research and is a professor of Jewish history at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. Then we have Ann Nelson, who is a research scholar at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies and Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, as well as the author of Red Orchestra, The Story of the Berlin Underground and the Circle of Friends Who Resisted Hitler, and Suzanne's Children, A Daring Rescue in Nazi Paris. We have Mordechai Paldiel, who is the former head of the Righteous Among the Nations Department at Yad Vashem, and he's currently an adjunct professor in Jewish history at Yeshiva University. And finally, we have Nathan Stoltzfus, who's a historian of modern Germany and is the Dorothy and Jonathan Rintel's Professor of Holocaust Studies at Florida State University. So thank you all again for sharing your time with us. And if any of our audience members have questions that you'd like to ask the panelists, please type them in the chat. We'll have a Q&A towards the end of the session. So Judy, I wanted to ask you a question. Why do you feel that Women Defying Hitler is a separate topic from the general one about both men and women defying the Nazis? How is women's defiance expressed, and why is it important to discuss women's defiance and what it can teach us?
Oh, thank you, Danielle. It's a very important question. Let's start with the book title. The book is called Women Defying Hitler, Rescue and Resistance Under the Nazis. What are our key terms? We've got rescue, we've got defying, we've got resistance. Defying, it means to oppose. To rescue is to save. To resist is to refuse to comply, to attempt to prevent. Why are women defying Hitler a separate topic than people defying Hitler, men and women? In fact, why are women a separate topic altogether? Because you can't answer the first question without answering the second. So here goes. How did I get to this topic in the first place of women? Why am I studying women in the Holocaust and women defying Hitler as a separate topic? Well, it started many years ago when I was interviewing, really many years ago, I was interviewing the mother of a very close friend of mine. She is what we would call an Auschwitz graduate. She was there when she was 20. And I was asking her about her experiences. And among the things that I asked, I turned to her and I said, Sipora, that was her name, that, was there anything different about women in Auschwitz that you can tell me? And she said, what are you talking about? The Nazis targeted all of us. We were all supposed to be killed. There's no difference. So I said, nevertheless, can you think of anything that, so she's thinking and thinking. I said, wait, there's one thing I can tell you. That when we got there, and the first thing that they did was when we were chosen in the selection for life, so they cut our hair, they shaved our heads, and they took away our clothes, and we were supposed to shower, and then they threw us some rags that were supposed to be our uniform. She said, I was there with my sister, who was 2 years younger than I am. I was 20, she was 18. And I looked around, and we went into the getting our hair shorn together, and we came out, and a minute later, I couldn't recognize her. where was she? And I was calling out, Leah, Leah, where are you? And she said, friends who had come, they'd all come from the same small town in Carpatho, Hungary. She said, girls, women who had gone in together, they couldn't recognize each other. And she said, that's a difference. It took us a long time without hair before we could actually see who was who. For men, that wasn't a problem. Men had short hair. They shaved their heads, so they could recognize each other, fathers, sons, brothers, etc. So, and this whole business about standing around without clothes in front of men was crazy for women, for us, for girls, sheltered. That was a really big difference. And I said, okay, can you think of any? She said, no, besides that, there was nothing else. I said, Zipporah, come on, think. She said to me, oh, well, you know what? There was something else. Physical strength. Most of the women who came didn't have as much physical strength. They were smaller than men. They didn't have as much physical strength. And there were some who did, but most of us didn't. And when we were given physical labor to do at the beginning, when we saw the men's groups doing the exact same thing, it was much harder for us. I said, okay, was there anything else? She said, well, you know, now that you asked, all of a sudden she said, there was one thing. We, most of us women, we were used before the war, girls, 18, 20, 16, we were learning in school, we were learning how to take care of a household. Our mothers were teaching us all sorts of domestic things. We knew how to do things that the men couldn't do. In other words, within a couple of minutes of getting these horrible rags as uniforms, one girl had stripped off a piece on the bottom and made herself a belt. Another one knew how to move things around. And within a few minutes, as weird as we looked, and she used that term in Hebrew, she said, nevertheless, it was a little bit different. And we looked at the men who were marching out of the other side, and they didn't have the background that we did. And I said, anything else? And she said, well, you know, there was one more difference between men and women during the Holocaust. She said, we had a double problem. Not only were we Jews, but we were women. In other words, we had to be especially careful because we were targeted, not only because we were Jews in the camp, but as women, we had to be very careful of the men. The Ukrainians who were the guards, even the Nazis who were there, usually they didn't start up with the men on the intimate level. With the women, you had to be very careful. We never let ourselves be alone. Women always walked around 2 or 3 together as protection so that Nazis wouldn't come and try to rape us. Yeah, it was forbidden, but you know what happens if nobody will catch you, so forbidden, forbidden. I said, and what about before that? I said, oh, you're asking about the ghetto? Now there were differences. You're going to ask, what does that have to do with defying Hitler? Well, I go on with the stories. How did women defy, and what does that have to do with the differences between men and women during the Holocaust? That's what the 12 chapters of our book are all about. And I'm going to speak about 3 different things, some of which I actually did learn from Zipporah, who I interviewed, and from other women who I have interviewed throughout the years. Differences in types of defiance of women against Hitler versus men against Hitler. The first one had to do with sabotage. This is a fascinating story. When Zipporah was chosen for life in Auschwitz, she and her sister were sent to a commando, a work detail, that worked in the major warehouse, the sorting warehouse in Auschwitz called Canada. Why it was called Canada? Because Canada was the dream of the place that had everything. And you could find everything in this warehouse. It was all the possessions that the Jews had brought with them to the camp. You had food, and you had clothing, and you had religious artifacts, all sorts of things. And they were supposed to throw away what was rags and pack up the rest of it in order to send it back to Germany to be used. And she said one of the things, because they were there during the winter of 1944-45, a lot of the people came with warm winter coats. And she said, this is the difference between the men and the women. The men working in the sorting would take the coats and they pull out the lining as much as possible. They would tear they would take out the threads so that a German woman would get the coat, put it on, and within 10 minutes, 15 minutes of wearing it, it would disintegrate. It would start falling apart on her. She said, that's how the men did it, destruction. The women did something else. She said, and this is without consulting with each other. We would write notes. As I said, you could get anything in Canada. There were pencils, there was paper, and we would write notes. German women, know that the coat that you were wearing belonged to a Jewish woman who was gassed to death in Auschwitz. And we would stick that deep into the pocket. That was our sabotage doing that. Both the men and the women, had they been caught, they would have been killed. But if you look, the women were dealing with a type of psychological sabotage, while the men were dealing with a more physical sabotage. Here's another difference between men and women when it comes to resistance. Participation in underground movements. This is something that I learned from Holocaust historian, the late Holocaust historian and Warsaw Ghetto and Auschwitz survivor, Yisrael Gutman. Gutman taught me something. I used to always teach and say that they used women as couriers because you couldn't say to a woman, drop your pants, and they would see that you were circumcised if you were a man, and then you'd be dead. So that's why they used women. And he once heard me say this in a lecture, and he said, no. So why? He said, that's not the whole story. He said, if you were talking about occupied Poland, 1942, 1943, what in the world would a Polish young man of 20 be doing traveling from one place to another? He should either be working on the farm or he should be working for the Nazis, a non-Jewish Pole, obviously. But he didn't have the opportunity. If you saw a man who was traveling from one city to another on a train, he was already suspect just because he was a man. You didn't have to say, drop your pants. He was a Jew. If you were a woman, so they dressed you up as if you were a country girl and you had a basket of eggs that you were going from the farm to sell in the city, that was perfectly normal. Of course, your basket of eggs, once they took the eggs out, they had guns underneath because you were a courier for the resistance. So basically, that was the difference in resistance between men and women. I've just given you two little differences. There are so many more. And for that, please go and read our book. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. That was really interesting. But Anne, I had a question for you as well. And I was wondering if you could talk to us about what role did pre-existing women's and feminist organizations play in the resistance, and why have they been largely overlooked?
I wrote my chapter for the collection based on two books that I wrote previously. Red Orchestra is about the anti-Nazi resistance in Berlin, and Suzanne's Children is about the anti-Nazi resistance in occupied Paris. And one thing that the groups I write about have in common is that they are people who could have been bystanders had they chosen to be. They were not the central figures were not Jewish, they were not communists. So if they had chosen, they could have sat out the war. And these women and the men that they worked with chose to oppose the Nazis out of a sense of conscience, out of a sense of loyalty to Jewish friends, for various personal reasons. And a number of them paid the price of their lives. Once they were detected, they were arrested and in many cases executed. So one question that you bring to these underground circles is, how do you decide whom to trust? Because all of the mechanisms of society are oriented towards people spying on their neighbors, and in some cases even on their family members. And on people being given incentives to turn each other in. If people came out of the camps, sometimes they were released from the punishment camps on the condition that they turned in other people who were anti-Nazis. And so how do you find people that you trust not to succumb to the incentives that are built into this regime? Well, one way is to go with people that you knew and you worked with before the war, before the regime. And so you had these women's organizations, and sometimes they were church circles or church charities where women would get together and have teas and raise money for orphans, things that you have in many Western countries. But you know who's who, you know what their moral compass is based on a long experience and association, and in some cases, friendship. So in occupied Paris, you had a figure who was very active in the rescue of Jewish children from deportation to Auschwitz that was based in the Protestant church, the l'Oratoire du Louvre. And you had these kind of ladies' aid societies, that's an American term for these groups, and who ran soup kitchens for the poor, which was not considered to be very political. But once they learned of the plight of the Jewish deportees and the children who were being arrested, they reshaped themselves to serve a resistance and a rescue network. It was the same individuals who'd run soup kitchens for homeless people, right? But they became politicized in that regard because they felt that the situation demanded it. And if you look, so the German term for these networks of resistors is very useful, Querverbindung. It's about overlapping circles or networks. So you don't have 100% overlap, but you have enough overlap that very different groups of people can work together and collaborate, sometimes even with people they've never met and never will meet, in order to serve their resistance function. And in both Berlin and in Paris, women were at the very heart of these, and women recruited other people and other women through these pre-existing women's organizations, which I found to be almost invisible in the pre-existing scholarship about resistance. You know, who's looking at, you know, church ladies having cake on Sunday afternoon, right? I was equally interested in the way that Jewish women, say in occupied Paris, joined forces as rescue and resistors with the Protestant women. Now, they didn't have exactly the same Ladies' Aid Society network, but you had immigrant Jewish women living in neighborhoods like the Marais and Belleville, who had very strong organizations before the war of various kinds of social solidarity. So a lot of times these were very intelligent women who were working in the garment trades, living in tenements, and maybe they had educations in Poland or wherever they'd come from and were not able to practice their professions. So they found blue collar jobs, but they had this keen intellectual interest. So you had book clubs, you had discussion clubs of the working mothers. They had daycare cooperatives. And these groups, of course, formed very, very strong personal bonds. And once you had the occupation take place, the men were initially arrested by the French authorities under the orders of the Germans, and they staged a very strong protest at the camp at Pithiviers. And the leaders of these pre-war women's groups were leading the march on the camp. And then as conditions grew more stringent, these same female leaders went underground and organized the women that had been in their social circles and their solidarity circles into resistance activities. And as was stated earlier, one very important aspect of this work was information. You're living under total censorship. The Germans dictate the content of the Vichy press, and it is full of lies. When they are deporting people to the concentration camps, they say it's to go do agricultural work in the Ardennes, for example, which was a lie. And somehow they needed to get the word to the people who were subject to arrest in time for them to go into hiding and avoid arrest. And this was done through flyers that were called tracts and slipped under doors, networks of women, sometimes employing their own children to alert the community to various dangers. So on the one hand, the impact of the Holocaust on France was terribly dolorous. On the other hand, there are many, many thousands of French Jews, including immigrant Jews, who escaped deportation and death through the various resistance activities, sometimes involving rescue, sometimes involving simply information. And networks of hiding places. And if you look beneath the surface, you will find that women are not only extremely active in every aspect of this, with the information, as couriers, as leaders of these circles, but in many cases, they're actually forming and leading their own women's networks.
Thank you. My next question is for Mordecai, and I was wondering, and I think this is a very important question. How do you counter sarcastic remarks made here and there that women who stood up to save their husbands, who happened to be Jewish, were only fulfilling their natural bound familial obligations, and that they can't be compared with other women who challenged Nazi racial policies by standing up for Jewish persons to whom they weren't bound by familial ties? So how does one respond to these challenges? And can you also clarify the uniqueness of the Rosenstrasse women protesters?
Yes, I will try at least. I come basically, my background is Yad Vashem. I was there for 24 years, and I headed the Department of the Righteous Among the Nations. It's a department that honors non-Jews who risk their life to save Jews. And we had a committee, or commission as we called it, that functioned as part in the role of a jury, and they would decide on who to bestow the title of Righteous Among the Nations based on certain criteria which the commission had established for itself. The commission was always headed by a judge, by a Supreme Court judge, either still functioning or retired. One of the debates in the commission was, do we honor everyone who saved a Jew? Or for instance, we had a question like, a person who was not Jewish, he was anything else but not Jewish, but by Nazi definition, according to the Nuremberg laws, he was still considered Jewish because his grandparents were Jewish. But he himself or she herself was not a Jew, was a Christian. Some of them were even ministers in the church, in Catholic Church or Lutheran Church. And they were considered Jewish by the Nazi regime, and they were consigned to deportation, and eventually they wound up in the concentration camp in the gas chamber. Well, a person who saved a baptized Jew, was he to be honored by Yad Vashem? Yes or no? So the opinions were divided. Some said that a person, a Christian, who saved a fellow Christian, although the Nazis considered him Jewish, but that person was saving a fellow Christian. We don't know whether that person would have saved another person if the other person was still a member of the Jewish people. And therefore, that's not our job to honor that person, it's job for the churches to honor. Other opinions in the commission said that anyone whom the Nazis persecuted, because in their eyes he was Jewish, then we as Jews, we are obligated to honor those who saved that person. Don't make a difference whether that person was a practicing Jew, an atheist, a communist, a Buddhist, a Christian, but if he was persecuted by the Nazi as a Jew, then, so opinions are still divided in the commission, and sometimes the ruling can go one way or another way because the ruling always goes by voting, and there are 25 members in the commission, and sometimes it can go this way or that way. The reason I mentioned that is one day in London, I attended a conference, and I met a person that I had never known before. His name was Nathan Stoltzfus. And he told me about the Rosenstrasse people. And he asked me, how come Yad Vashem does nothing about this? Well, one of the criteria of the commission at Yad Vashem is that anyone who saves his or her spouse is not to be honored by under this program, because that's a filial, that's a basic human obligation for someone to save someone in the what they call the nuclear family, and therefore we don't honor that. Of course, the thing is not so simple. What about somebody who saves someone who they live as a husband and wife, but they're not yet married, or they don't believe in marriage, or they're not married, and he or she saves the other fellow? In that case, we would honor them because they're not married. They can always walk away from being involved. But if they are married, then they have that moral compact, that moral obligation. It is not that simple, I have to tell you. Okay. But then, the argument at Yad Vashem was these women at Rosenstrasse, they were trying to save their husbands, not other fellow Jews to whom they were not attached. And so while we should be thankful to them and appreciate them, but this is not something that we should glorify in and talk and honor and acknowledge in a grand style. Nathan told me this is it's not fair, it's unjust, because this was a major event. And I was sitting there and we were sipping a cup of coffee there outside on the boardwalk in the coffee shop. And I could not but agree with Nathan about this. And I went back to Jerusalem, I did some research, and I found out about the immensity of that Rosenstrasse thing, which was unprecedented in Nazi Germany, unprecedented in Berlin, unprecedented the year it took place at the height of Nazi power. And I felt that something ought to be done to acknowledge these women who, standing on the street, not knowing what the response would be of the Gestapo, the SS, and the other military formations, they could have been hauled away, arrested for sure, taken to concentration camps for sure, maybe even killed. The Nazis were killing their own generals who plotted against Hitler. So anyone who contested the Nazi regime was not sure of his life. In 1944, the great German military leader, Erwin Rommel, was forced to commit suicide because his name appeared on the list of the plotters against Hitler, although he was not involved in the plot itself. But anyway, so I reestablished contact with Nathan when I left Yad Vashem. I retired. And then we discussed the possibility of highlighting the story of the Rosenstrasse protesters. So we didn't know how to go about it. But then Nathan asked me to look up a certain man by the name of Volker Berghan, who was a professor at Columbia University. I called him and he told me, why don't you meet me outside the subway station, the 116th subway station on Broadway. And he was waiting for me and we went, and from then on, we started planning a conference at Columbia, which took place and made quite an impact. And after this conference, in which I participated, Nathan and Nelson was there, some others, including the German Consul General said a few words. We decided maybe this thing, and we had quite a number of speakers who spoke about this and that aspect of women resistors. I was not myself so much involved in the women thing. I was involved in the Rosenstrasse persons who happened to be the women. They protested. And later on, we decided we were going to go ahead and publish a book about women resistors under the title Women Resisting Hitler. So here I am. So the debate is still on between people who tend to make sarcastic remarks that we shouldn't overplay the Rosenstrasse, but I think we should. And I'll explain. This is not simply one or two ladies speaking out for their Jewish husbands. This is about hundreds of women standing on the street in Berlin, shouting, "Release our husbands, release our husbands," not knowing what the response will be, okay? They were risking their own safety, the safety of their children, children of mixed marriages. They didn't know that the Nazi regime, going all the way up to Hitler, to Goebbels and Hitler, would decide to release the Jewish husbands, most of whom who were incarcerated or were being held in Rosenstrasse on that street. They didn't know that some of the men that had already been sent to Auschwitz were, the commander of Auschwitz was told to release them and send them back home. They couldn't have known this beforehand. And so having a demonstration in Berlin in front of all the citizens of Berlin was a signal to all the others, perhaps, to make a demonstration of their own. This was very dangerous for the Nazi regime. And the Nazi regime capitulated here. It's very rare for a totalitarian regime to capitulate to protesters. But this is what happened here. They capitulated. The Jewish husband went home, and they didn't face deportation, at least not when this demonstration took place in February and March 43. And maybe later on, as the curtain was coming down on Nazi Germany in late 1944, persons who, Jewish husbands like Otto Klemperer, who was married to a non-Jewish woman, he himself sought refuge and left Dresden after the heavy bombardment. But this was in the last months of the Nazi regime. So I feel that any person who challenged the Nazis on something which was at the heart of the Nazi belief, what the Nazis considered to be the greatest crime, the greatest sin that a person can perform, is the mixing of pure blood with impure blood, what they called Rassenschande. And here we have Jewish men and non-Jewish women performing Rassenschande continuously right there in Berlin. They are living together as husband and wife. And the Nazi regime didn't know how to solve that. At the Wannsee conference, the discussion went very much about what to do with these mixed marriages. There were suggestions that to cancel the marriage, and this didn't go very well because the state had no right to cancel the marriage. There were other ideas which came forth. Some of these marriages were performed in the church, in the Catholic Church, and you cannot cancel a marriage performed. That means getting in trouble with the church leaders about marriages which are performed in the church, considered one of the sacraments of the Catholic religion, holy marriage. But anyway, I'm coming back. These women who protested, they could not figure out, they did not know beforehand what the response would be. In fact, while they were standing on the street, jeeps turned up, loaded with machine guns, and they were threatened that they would open fire on them, but this didn't happen. So I know that the debate is still on, and even in Germany, the story of the Rosenstrasse people are not really publicized in headline formation. In Germany, the big thing is about the 20th of July plotters. These are generals, most of them, who supported Hitler when things were going well for Germany. And then they began to change their mind when things were going bad for Germany. And they decided, in order to save Germany from total collapse, Hitler had to be removed. So these are the heroes. This is the 20th of July in Germany. And these are the people who are still being celebrated. And when you come to these women who were not generals and didn't have the backing of any of society and didn't have the backing of social leaders, certainly not of the military, this is still downplayed. And I think justice has to be done here. And especially what I and Nathan are interested is to look up some of the relatives of these Rosenstrasse women. In the 1950s, their names were tabulated. I found this at Tel Aviv University, a list of hundreds of names of these women and their addresses in Berlin, but that was in the early 1950s. Most of them probably are no longer here. They have passed on, but they have children and grandchildren. And some of these children and grandchildren might be here with us in the United States and Canada. And I suggested with Nathan, and we both agreed it would be nice if we could have a reunion of the offspring of these women who saved their husbands, and they continue to have families. And these children, grandchildren, if they could meet each other at a gala reunion and tell their stories, what they did after the war, that would be a great message to show that it is possible to resist even regimes such as the Nazi regime. I, of course, submitted 2 articles about women rescuers, one of non-Jewish women and then of Jewish women rescuers. So I have my 2 articles in the book. I just want to point out that it was, relatively speaking, easier for women, Jewish women especially, to be rescuers than men in one respect only. Jewish women, many of them served as couriers and emissaries, passing on information, and Jewish underground operatives chose women over men. The problem with men, Jewish men, is they could always be stopped, and in spite of their good looks and their identification cards, they could always be told to take off their pants, and if they were circumcised, then nothing could help, they were Jewish. So this could not apply to women. And that's why women did play a role. Maybe you've heard the names of Latka Mead and Maria Abramska, better known today as Miriam Pelik, and others who saved as couriers. This was true in Poland, but it was also true in other countries. In France too, in Nice, also the Nazis used, in order to identify persons who claimed they were not Jewish, men, they took them to a corner and asked them to remove their pants. If they were circumcised, well, that's it. They had to board a train to go to Auschwitz. This is all I have to say now, and I turn the floor back to Danielle. Thank you. Danielle, it's all yours. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Danielle, do you want me to go? Okay, fine. Good, good, good. Well, thank you so much, Mordecai. I so much appreciate your friendship. And there was actually on Rosenstrasse in the protest, one couple, Gerhard and Ursula Braun, who were only engaged. They might be candidates under these rules of Yad Vashem. There was also, I heard of at least 2 or 3 who were there who weren't married. So maybe these people who were protesting and weren't related could also be recognized. In any case, I was going to talk about the place of Rosenstrasse protest in Nazi history. I, of course, tend to interpret this a little bit more broadly than some, and here's why. There are 3 points. I think it's not just about the protest, but it's about intermarried couples. That's really the appropriate context. And then I think it has something to say about how the regime made decisions. That's really what I wanted to find out in order to assess why intermarried Jews survived on the whole and why the protest was had an effect. Also, I didn't start out following women and resistance either, but I was very interested from the beginning in what I think Judy has called day-to-day stand, and what Václav Havel has called the attempt to live in the truth. That is a different kind of resistance, a civil courage, really, rather than going underground and appearing to blow things up aimed at Hitler. So it's a different kind of resistance, I think, that women illustrate here. Now, this is not just about the protest. In early 1943, as Mordecai was describing this came from an arrest in Berlin that Himmler called the elimination of Jews from German soil arrest. It was the arrest of more than 10,000 Jews that Goebbels intended that would allow him to declare Berlin free of Jews, as he writes. It was a massive arrest that the Berlin Gestapo called the final roundup. They would be done. And had it not been for the protest, this certainly would have happened. Thousands of intermarried Jews would have been deported. Moreover, in Auschwitz, we know from the correspondence that survives that in Auschwitz, where they needed workers, they had just sent off 6,000 Polish laborers who were making trouble. They were afraid they were going to
Hello,
cause. And
Liam. Liam,
What's up?
I'm supposed to be doing the Zoom, and
Danielle,
can you hear me?
yes.
I'm very sorry. My Zoom is going crazy, and I can't see the screen or click any buttons. So, but I'm also the host, so I apologize that you could hear me in the middle. I'm not sure why I'm tech supporting it right now. I'll step away from the computer.
Okay, Danielle, thanks for your help. It's invaluable. Anyway, I was just saying that one of the best pieces of evidence here about the effectiveness of protests is that we have the correspondence of the economic SS, as they were called, from Auschwitz, where they needed laborers. They were expecting 9,000 to 15,000 skilled laborers from Berlin. Now they had to be from the factories, and they couldn't have been met. That number could have never been met without intermarried Jews, and more than 2,000, in fact, that were held at Rosenstrasse. But certainly these intermarried Jews were supposed to be sent off and never seen again, as somebody in a position to know expressed it. In fact, but the non-Jewish wives protested on the street for a week, and thousands of Jews were rescued. I think the protest, first of all, is emblematic of a long struggle between intermarried couples and the regime that began as Hitler took power. And the presumption the Nazis had was that surely the pressures on these couples would lead very quickly to these non-Jewish partners, the women divorcing their men. And they found out that this wasn't true. They escalated the pressures over time, year by year. And these non-Jewish women and their partners and children, in fact, held tight, and more than 90% did not divorce, according to studies in Vienna, all the way up to northern Germany and various other studies. So the protest in early 1943 was just the climax of this escalating battle about what would happen to these family members, the Jewish family members of these intermarried couples, with German non-Jewish women were on the edge of that knife. Secondly, the history is about intermarriage, not just about the protests, as I was saying, and how the regime responded. Intermarriage history, beginning with Hitler's early days in power, is the central context. Each time the neighbors and the Nazis stepped up pressures and ostracism, these intermarried German women redoubled their noncompliance and protest whatever was needed. As Mordecai was mentioning, Victor Klemperer's diary just shows how quickly that social death set in for Jews, and it extended beyond their neighbors and colleagues to their own families of birth. These women who I talked to had a terrible time and were just expelled in many cases from their families of birth. And I look at this as these women having built up muscle day by day, stand by stand, so that by the time this, they had to put their lives on the line there in a protest that went on for a week, they were able to do that rather than compromising step by step, which so many did, and precisely because they didn't have the same motivation as these women. But these women pushed back and stepped with the pressures. And the result is that intermarried Jews comprised virtually all of the full German Jews who survived Hitler without going into hiding or outlasting Hitler's camps, that is, some 13,000. How can you explain their survival? Bruno Blau, a Jewish statistician in Berlin for the Jewish community and authorities, wrote in 1950 that, surprising as it may seem, it was intermarried Jews who survived. And the surprise for him came as he contrasted the wisdom and the knowledge, which held in almost all cases, except for this one, that integration didn't help Jews survive. Finally, the protest within the context of intermarriage is about how the regime made decisions. This is what I went to find out about initially when I began investigating this, because how could you know whether these people had any impact without knowing how those decisions were made? For a network of reasons, Gestapo practice was to wait for the non-Jewish partner to divorce, and then that person would be sent off like other Jews. However, studies show, as I said, 90% of these intermarriages didn't divorce. The protest illustrates the will by German women to save their family members who were Jewish. Given their survival as well as decisions Hitler himself made about these couples, the main one dividing intermarried couples into privileged on the one hand and non-privileged on the other in December of 1938, which his personal secretary, Martin Bormann, said was a fundamental decision on the Jewish question. Given that, as well as the survival, we can't really tell the history of Nazis or the history of the Holocaust without talking about these intermarried couples. There are a few ways that intermarried history sheds light on how the Nazis ruled. Cumulative radicalization has helped us understand how the Holocaust happened. Some dispute that, of course, but if you take that, it's clear that it did not operate within the Reich. The mechanism of cumulative radicalization did not operate within the Reich as it did in occupied territories. And the history helps us show that within the Reich, ruling his race, Hitler did not always simply turn up the terror to combat defiance. He wanted to provide clear benefits to those following him so that they learn to follow him unquestioningly. It becomes more complicated here and goes against common wisdom. Hitler protecting his image, which was really the glue that held the consensus together more than anything else, Hitler's image. And he didn't want to risk that. So certainly the effectiveness is confirmed by other incidents of defiance as well as the targeted form that terror took within the Reich. It revealed by the reliance on incentives to deepen commitment to Nazism, one organized resistance had been neutralized. This also confirmed the effect is also confirmed by entries in Goebbels' diaries, November the 2nd, 1943. He mulls over how brute force is effective for rule. And he does that in the context of a decision that had to be made about what to do with women who were supposed to be living in other parts of Germany and not in their cities where they were being bombed. And Hitler actually decreed that it was not the right means, even manipulating food rations so that these women could only get food rations in their evacuation sites. So it was a debate, and you can tell that looking at Goebbels' diary, November 2nd, 1943, where he says, yes, indeed, force works if you just lay down the line and say, here's the line, folks, if you cross it, you get terror. And you know, of course, may well be right, but that was something that Goebbels wrote in November after another women's protest of 300 women. And this, we have the complete secret police document. I think it's dated November the 18th, 1943, that talks about women protesting to get food rations in their cities where they lived and not in the evacuation sites. Well, one thing Goebbels could have said in his entry, he said, you know, that the people are learning where the regime's flexible spot is, and that they're forcing the regime's hand by going on the street. And every time the regime gives in, it loses a little bit of authority. Well, he could have said women instead of people, because it was women who initiated and carried out these street protests. Men had other forms of opposition, mostly, you know, resorting to guns and bombs. The final question might be then whether there were specifically women's forms of defiance, whether bringing women's defiance into mainstream debate would change our categories for understanding resistance. So the protest, as I see it, is connected to a range of issues, including that issue of day-to-day stand resistance. Back to you, Danielle.
Are you able to still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm having very major technical difficulties. I apologize. I can't click any buttons on my screen or see the chat or do anything. So my apologies.
Would you like me to read out the chat, Danielle? Would that make it easier for you?
No, I can't. If you could read any questions that come from the chat.
I'm going to read out the questions, okay?
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Fine. Okay, so Catherine Ehrlich has asked the following. I'd be happy to hear more about women as information vectors under stress. It seems like an invisible resistance form of longstanding. And Beverly Chalmers says, how are intermarried women viewed today in Israel, other places? Are there similarities, differences, accepting, of course, the extremes of murder, but in terms of social isolation, exclusion? So we have women as vectors of information under stress, and we have intermarried women in Israel and in other places today. Who wants to answer?
I'll jump in. And first I want to congratulate Catherine Ehrlich on the publication of her new book, Irma's Passport, about her Jewish grandmother and her experience in Prague, Vienna, and beyond. It's a major accomplishment. And in terms of information vectors, again, you're living through a period where written communication is very dangerous. Letters between people, telephone communications are very dangerous because of the high degree of monitoring. And what I feel is often overlooked is the way women can get together and have conversations and private conversations that didn't appear as suspicious to the Nazis, partly because they tended to underestimate women continually and really see them as people who belonged in the kitchen with the children. And so women were not only able to communicate plans and ideas and strategies among themselves and then take them back to other circles, they were able also to organize social events. And so with the Circle of the Red Orchestra, a lot of communications in Berlin in the resistance group happened at their tea dances. In some cases, through friendships at the US Embassy, they organized a celebrated party at the embassy through friendships with the ambassador's daughter, and did recruitment for their resistance movement. And then beyond that, you also have these tracts. They had different names in different countries, but they would harvest actual information from foreign radio broadcasts, from different networks, print it up, well, type it up on a typewriter and then reproduce it on a form of a mimeograph machine and distribute it. And so there was just a tremendous amount of information that could not be passed along that women were essential for in terms of passing along secretly or quietly or socially. And then beyond that, you had the role of women in intelligence networks, and often these were nationals. They were French nationals, or in the case of Red Orchestra, you had a Jewish woman who worked with radio transmissions. And this was not exactly in the resistance category. It was in working for foreign intelligence services, but it was critical to the war effort against the Germans nonetheless, and women played an extremely important role in this shortwave radio work.
Okay, that is absolutely fascinating. Anybody want to add something else about the question before we go on to the second one? Nathan, Mordechai? Women as information vectors under stress?
Am I being asked to ask a question, or am I being asked to respond to a question?
To respond. Do you have anything to say about women as information vectors under stress?
About women in?
as information vectors, carrying out information from one place to another under stress?
Oh, yes, sure. Especially Jewish women who acted as couriers. And well, I'm going to take you to Poland now, in occupied Poland and occupied Lithuania, where Jews were locked up in ghettos. And that lasted from 40 to 42 approximately. And it was forbidden Jews to be found outside of the ghetto under the pain of death. So how could information be transferred from one place to another? Well, for instance, in Vilna, Vilna has the sad history that the German occupation of Vilna, which was then part of the Soviet Union, the occupation of Vilna in July 41 was accompanied immediately with mass shootings of Jews in a nearby forest called Panari, with thousands, tens of thousands of Jews were being slaughtered by the Germans and the help of Lithuanian collaborators. Well, it just so happened that the clandestine organization in Vilna, headed by a man known as Abba Kovner, decided that the people in the Warsaw Ghetto and other ghettos had to be warned that the Nazi plan is murder, extermination. When people in the other ghettos in Poland were not sure that the Nazis were going to follow this up, the ghettoization with mass extermination. In fact, that this was discounted. The belief was Jews would be forced to be in the ghettos until the war was over, hopefully until the Germans had lost the war. But so Jewish women were sent out from Vilnius to Warsaw, to Lublin and other places to tell the so-called leaders inside the ghetto that the Germans were planning to make the Jews disappear from the face of the earth. And so that they should start preparing for something in the event that this would happen to the Jews in the ghettos. So women were used as couriers. Why women? As I said before, women cannot be forced to undress and show whether they were circumcised or not, as men. Women could also hide their appearance. They could, if they had black hair, they could color their hair to blonde. They could use makeup. It was not customary for men then, as today, to use makeup. So women use makeup in order to make them look more like local natives, like local Polish women. And so they could travel on train. The other thing is there was in Poland the local police, known as the Blue Police. Usually they had a little bit more respect for women than for men. And so women were used as couriers all over Poland, Jewish women, rather than men. Some of them then eventually were carrying false identities, fake identities, which they delivered to Jewish people in hiding. And then they would go and check up to see if the hiding place was fine and if maybe they had to change their hiding place. So women were used in that capacity more than men. Men, as Judy alluded already, were more active in physical resistance, like what happened in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, or in the forest. Just so happened there were more men as partisans than women. And so women were more in a capacity of transferring information, transferring false identities, and so forth. But I want to point out something else, which I mentioned before. The Nuremberg laws stated clearly, Nuremberg laws of September 1935, that sexual relations between Aryans and Jews was punishable. Now, here you have Jewish women married to Jewish men, non-Jewish women, I'm sorry, and having sexual relations on a daily basis. Now, I want to point out in the Nazi thinking, why the Rosenstrasse story is so important. According to the Nazi screwed up ideas, it was a worse crime for Jewish men to have close relations with Jewish women than for Jewish women having close, intimate relations with so-called Aryan men. Why? Because in the opposite case, where a Jewish woman is married to a non-Jewish man, the non-Jewish man is inseminating her with Aryan content. So he's making her a little bit more Aryan. So that's not the best idea, but that's not as bad. But if the man is Jewish, he was poisoning her blood, the Aryan blood, destroying her blood and destroying the offspring. The children that were born about us are already contaminated. So that to Hitler was worse. If you ever read Mein Kampf that Hitler wrote while he was in jail, or he dictated that and then was published after he got out of jail, which became the Bible in Nazi Germany after he came to power. If you didn't read Mein Kampf, I urge you all to read it. Just read it once, that's enough. Don't have to read it twice because it's really a lot of nonsense and repetitive things. But he says that every Jewish man has got only one idea in his mind: how to seduce an Aryan woman and then inseminate her blood and destroy her blood so she could never be a pure Aryan. That's what every Jewish man has on his mind. So this is in Mein Kampf. And so that's why these Rosenstrasse women, they were married to Jewish men. And so that's why for them, the danger was even greater. As Nathan pointed out, they were constantly under pressure to get divorced. So the men could be picked up then and taken to concentration camps, which couldn't be done while they were still married. These women stayed married to their husband, saved their lives. So they're all, in my eyes, they're all rescuers. They saved their husband by simply staying married. There are even stories of women who were considering divorce. Their marriage didn't go well, but they decided to postpone it until after the war. So the importance of these Rosenstrasse women, the importance to them in Hitler's own eyes, and Hitler was forced to capitulate here, which is unthinkable for a man like Hitler to capitulate on such an essential thing to him. Let's not forget that the last words of Hitler before he committed suicide in his political testimony is, "I call upon the future nations of the future leaders of the nation to continue the struggle against the poisoners of humanity, comma, international Judaism, the poisoners of humanity." The last word in the long political testimony. And then he went into a side room and he shot himself, together with Eva Braun. So that's why I think when we downplay the story of the Rosenstrasse women, I think we are missing on a very important point, and that ought to be corrected.
Thank you very much, Mordechai. That is marvelous. I would like to answer very quickly what Beverly Chalmers had asked, because it really doesn't have to do with the book. How are intermarried women viewed today? I gather that the question is about intermarried Jewish women. It very much depends where and when. And you ask, are there similarities, differences, excepting, of course, extremes of murder, but in terms of social isolation and exclusion? Like most groups, people like to live with like. In other words, most intermarried women, I am sure, are living in communities where there are others like them. And so therefore there is no problem, because it is a socially accepted thing. You take any group, it has nothing to do with women, has nothing to do with intermarried, has nothing to do with Jewish. You take any group and you put them in isolation within another group where there's nobody else like them. Obviously, there will be issues of isolation and differences. Like always goes with like. So it's a very loaded question, but it's also very easy to answer. And however, because it doesn't have to do with the book and the topic of the book, so I really don't want to go into it in any detail. Is there anything that anyone else would like to add? You can open up your microphones and you can ask. It's okay. So if not, Danielle.
Judy, I simply want to say something. I want on this occasion again to express my thanks to Volker Berghan, who is in the audience. Without him, we would not have been able to take even the first step. When I met Volker at Columbia University, he immediately was so positive about having a conference in Columbia, and he even pointed out the place we went and inspected the place where we could have, right at the first meeting, he was so positive about this. And without him, we wouldn't be here today with the book. So thank you again, Volker.
Yes, thank you very much. That's certainly true.
And I thank all of you for attending. Danielle, I don't know if your microphone is working, but if it is, you can say something.
I think my microphone is still working, but thank you so much to everyone who attended. Thank you so much to our panelists for sharing your knowledge and your expertise with us. It was fascinating. And thank you all again.
And now go and read the book. Good night to everyone.
May I ask Professor Panelists to repeat what he said with the last words of Hitler? I didn't make a note of it correctly, and I'd like to make sure I've got it right. Or somebody else.
The last words that I said, I thanked Volker.
No, the last words of
Hitler's last words.
What's that?
Hitler's